Lindsay here, the Frugal Crafter. Today we're going to make some fun steampunky cards using some stamps from Visible Image and some other stencils too, and also some fun pigment powders from Paper Artsy. You can find all of these supplies at our sponsor topflightstamps.com, and I have a 10% off coupon code for you as well. Use the coupon code thefrugalcrafter10 to save 10% on your order, and you always get free shipping on orders over 50 in the United States. So check out Top Flight Stamps. They bring the coolest stamps from around the world to customers here in America. So I'm starting off just by spritzing through this stencil. It's called Fibers, I believe, and basically I just want to get kind of like a random kind of watery imprint on my paper. Now I'm going to apply my first pigment powder, and I don't want to like have too much come out, so doesn't have like a dispenser in the bottle. So what I'm going to do is I'm just using a pipette, which is like an eyedropper, except it's very flexible. I think an eyedropper would work fine, but the reason I like this is that I can kind of suck a little bit of the powder into the pipette, and then I can kind of put it on its side and poof air over it, so it kind of just lightly dusts the paper, because what happens is when the powder hits the wet area, you get this really kind of cool explosion of colors. And the thing that I've noticed is that there's different colors in the powder, so you get a very unique effect. You don't just get one solid color, you get a randomized color with lots of different like kind of speckles in it. It's really very pretty. If your paper is not very wet, the powder is just going to sit there. So that last color that I put on, that kind of like reddish, kind of like tomato red color, rusty red, wasn't doing anything. So I spritzed it with my fine mist sprayer, but that really wasn't the look I was going for. So I decided to get a little more aggressive with the spritzing of color and try to encourage some drips. And so I've got this spray bottle, which is really like a garden type of sprayer or plant mister. And I was able to get bigger droplets this way. And I think when you're playing with a product like this, whether it be these infusion pigment powders from Paper Artsy or any of the other pigment powders that are out on the market, the best thing is just to experiment with it until you get a look that you like. That stencil that I originally put down is pretty much not, it's not really affecting the design too much here, but it gave me a starting point, and sometimes that's what you need when you're creating. By the time I added more water, it became apparent that I had way more media on this cardstock than I needed, so I just grabbed another sheet and decided to press it straight down and make a print of this design. Now this cardstock I'm using is actually a very inexpensive smooth Bristol from the craft store, so it's pretty much like a cardstock with a little bit more sizing to it, so it's just better designed to handle wet techniques. But for this purpose, cardstock is going to work just fine. So now I ended up having two very colorful backgrounds. Then I laid them side by side face up, and I used a stencil kind of as a stamp just to kind of imprint a texture back onto the paper, because I really thought it looked cool, because when I lay it down it would kind of let the paint puddle up around it and just give me some really interesting effects. So at this point I decided to let it dry overnight and come back in the morning and decide what I wanted to do with these papers. The cool thing about doing a background like this is that you end up with a bunch of paper to work with. So I chopped those 9x12 pieces of cardstock into quarters. So I basically have bases for 8 cards. And I thought it'd be kind of fun to use this kind of swirly, almost looks like James Bond, cool background. And I thought that the colors in the powder from Paper Artsy would look really nice with the paints that I have from Paper Artsy. I only have the 4 fresco colors, kind of that are kind of earthy jewel tones, and they're just really versatile. The other reason I decided to choose these rather than other acrylic paints I have is because they're a very matte finish paint, and I'll be able to go on top of them with markers and stamping and other media. So it's a nice underlayer type of product to use. And I'm going to be using my makeup sponges to apply this to the stencil. I'm also working on a nonstick craft mat, so I'm not just squirting paint on my table, in case you're wondering. I'm starting with my lightest color in the center to kind of bring the eye into the focal point area. I knew that my background was so bright that it was going to be difficult for any stamped images to show up, so I really wanted to get that lighter color in there first to give me a little bit of contrast with the background. Here you can see how much of the light color I added. Now I'm going in with a little bit of that reddish color and just kind of tapering it in so it just kind of fades out. Notice how I didn't bring the white all the way down to the bottom of the stencil. Since my stencil was not big enough to cover my piece of paper, I didn't want to have an abrupt ending to that shape. I just wanted to kind of dissolve into the universe, as the case may be when you see this this card finished, you'll know what I mean. And then I used cues from the background that I made and chose similar colors to fade out different parts of the spiral. So here I'm going in with this yellow color because I had some yellow on the paper underneath, and then I'll be fading in a little bit of a blue. And also that nice midnight blue works really well for adding a frame to the edge of your panel. And I always think that gives it kind of a finished look when you can go in with a darker color like that. After you've removed the stencil, you can go in on the edges with any of the darker colors or any of the colors that you used. Here I'm using that reddish color and dragging it in, and it just kind of gives you a frame, that finished look I talked about, and helps kind of seamlessly blend your different design elements. You're blending the stencil into the rest of the background, and I think it's just a really great technique to learn. And it's important to, I think, see these layers. So if you see my card in the hot mess stage, you'll know that when your card's in the hot mess stage, that you just got to stick with it. It will turn out fine. Enjoy playing and enjoy the process. Here I'm just pulling up some of that blue so I could pull that swirl from the stencil into the main design of the card. This is also a great technique if you don't have a lot of ink pads, because we always see the blending edge techniques with the ink pads. You can use acrylic paint, and if you already have it, then save yourself some money. So here's the stamp set we're going to use from Visible Image. I love it because it's got a cool steampunk vibe, and there are stamps in there for all of my nerdiness. There is stuff that could be used for Doctor Who, there's stuff that could be used for the Twin Peaks revival, there's like just so much goodness. There's Alice in Wonderland that you could use that for. That's just a lot of fun. I decided to use Ranger Black Archival ink because it's waterproof, and I intended to use some water-based media on top. I'm going to be using some water-based markers as well as some gel pens. So a couple things that I think will work really well on this. So I started off with the door, thinking that would be a really fun kind of story setting, and now I'm stamping the guy falling out of the door. It looks like he could be the doctor, and I'm going to stamp his companion, or the woman. It looks like it could be his companion from Doctor Who, of course, and I thought that was a lot of fun. Now, the thing that I noticed about this was that the door didn't really stand out very much, and even though I could color it with markers, I didn't think it was going to stand out quite enough. So I decided to stamp it on some yellow cardstock and cut it out. You want to make sure when you're cutting something out that has a middle that you cut the middle part out first before you cut out the outside. That gives you a little bit more stability as you're cutting, and it gives you a place to hang on to so you don't accidentally rip or cut through the edge. I also cut out an extra middle of the door so that I could use it as a mask, and here I'm sponging on some of the blue paint just to give me a little bit of distinction between the outside of the door and the inside of the door. I wanted it to kind of look like when you're looking through the open doorway that it's light and bright in the middle and it's kind of darker on the outside, like maybe you're peering into another world. I also thought our universe needed some stars, so I'm just using some watery white acrylic paint and flicking on some spatter with a toothbrush, and it just gives us that kind of nebula look. While my spattered stars were drying, I took a very light tan marker and decided to add some shading on my little yellow doorway, which I'm going to end up painting over in a few steps, so I don't even know why I'm showing you this. And then we're going to glue it down onto our card base. Now, as for paint, I just used the stuff that was left over on my palette anyway, so it didn't go to waste, and I didn't have to get out anything new. Honestly, I think it looked fine on camera here, but I was definitely noticing a lack of dimension when I was looking at the card in real life, and you can see as we add that lighter kind of creamy yellow paint, it does make the door feel like it's more three-dimensional. So that's basically what I was doing, just highlighting and shading with the acrylic paint. So it's another great save if you end up really not liking something, because you can make your acrylic paint opaque and add layers where you think that your card might be just destined for the trash can. Acrylic paint can be a wonderful thing in those situations. My little people didn't stand out in the background as much as I liked, so I grabbed my white gel pen and just added in some details. And I wanted this to really look like the doctor, and I was thinking that it would be a really cool, doctor to have the 12th Doctor there, which is Matt Smith. And so, of course, I had to sketch on a little bow tie and paint it red and give him a fez. So that's kind of what I'm adding in at this point. And how can we have the Doctor without a TARDIS? So honestly, this is like the easiest painting demo. You're going to take a flat brush and you're going to put a couple strokes down for the body of the TARDIS. It is in a far distance, so it does not have to be that good or accurate. And you can either have it straight on just by putting kind of like a flat stroke across the bottom and then a couple little strokes at the top, or you could have it facing you. It really is completely up to you and how much time and energy you want to put into it. And we're going to do some detailing with some sparkly gel pens as well, so great time to break those out. And I literally just took a glittery blue gel pen and glazed over the entire thing. Really, honestly, easy peasy, don't stress yourself out, just have a good time with this. Since most colored gel pens, especially if they have glitter in them, are translucent, you can go over colors with similar colored gel pens and just kind of slightly augment the color and add that little bit of shine that I think looks so fantastic. The one time I want a really opaque gel pen is when I want white, and I use a Uniball Signo Gel Impact Broad White Gel Pen, and it is my absolute favorite. I use it for watercoloring, I use it for card making, I use it all the time. It just gives you a super opaque pop of color. Other white gel pens I've tried just simply don't have that opacity. I wanted a little bit more contrast between the kind of the space portal they were coming out of inside the door and where they currently were, so I decided to add a little bit of watered down white acrylic paint inside the door. And what I'm doing is just kind of adding it to the edges and corners, and then I'm simply going to blend it out with a little bit of water to kind of make the, so you could still see that that background in the middle, but I wanted a little bit lighter around the edges of the inside of the door. And that is about it for the focal panel on this card, and I'll show you how I turn this into a card a little bit later, but first I wanted to show you a quick idea with some of the other stamps in the set. Now this stamp set comes with a lot of shadow stamps, and by shadow stamps I mean solid image stamps that work great with a really bold background like this. But sometimes when you get into like really big stamps like the one I'm showing you right here, it's really hard to get a good impression, especially if you don't have like a cushion under your mat. So you can see that I had a hard time getting the stamp to contact with the paper. So whenever I'm using a big stamp like that and I'm having a hard time getting a good impression, what I like to do is flip it upside down. So you want to ink up your stamp really well, and I'm using a pigment ink because that helps a little bit with the shadow stamps. And now I'm going to choose a background to go with it, and then I'm going to lay it down on top of the stamp and then kind of press down on the back of the paper with my hand, kind of like I'm burnishing it, which is a printmaking technique. And then you'll see I get a much better impression this time. Smaller shadow stamps, though, like this group of birds kind of floating out of his head, they don't really need to be stamped upside down because there's space in between the images, making it easier for it to stamp. Same goes with like the smaller figures that we stamped in the other card. It just didn't really need that that technique because there were smaller areas. You didn't need to get even pressure over such a large surface. I decided to use a little gear for the other eyeball because I thought it was very steampunky. And then I gave the panel plenty of time to dry so the glue could dry and also the pigment ink underneath could dry, because I knew I wanted to do some embossing, and I figured, well, I've got this ink pad out, I'm just going to use this for my embossing ink because it is a sticky pigment ink. I will tell you that the clear embossing ink or glycerin does work a little bit better for embossing because it's just a little stickier. It grabs more powder, but I thought this would be good. That way if I didn't get a really good emboss, the black would still show up on my background. And even though this is a big stamp, because it's got open space in there, I can just stamp it normally. Next time though, I would make sure to have a cushion underneath my splat mat so that I could more easily get a good impression. I chose some metallic gold and also some burgundy tapestry embossing powder to give the kind of swirly clock area a little bit of a dimension. This would be really cool for a Twilight Zone themed card as well. You got a lot of options here. It's really important not to pour the embossing powder back into the original containers when you're mixing like this. You could keep them for this project or put them in a separate storage container, but you don't want to put it back in the original containers. And I was getting a little bit of the powder sticking to that first bit of black ink that I had stamped, so I just kind of brushed it away with my finger, and now I'm just heat setting the design here. I was inspired by the new season of Twin Peaks when I saw the stamps that said future and past, and so I'm using white pigment ink, which is a really juicy ink pad, and some white embossing powder to stamp and emboss both of the images. Now I like to do one at a time because that ink is going to be freshest right off the bat, right after you stamp it, so I know it's going to hold the powder better. Now if you do get powder sticking to places on the background that you don't want, just use a soft brush just to flick away any of the leftover powder. You want to repeat that with the other stamped image and heat emboss both of them. And yes, for those of you with eagle eyes, I did change my embossing gun because my Marview one just heats up so much faster than my Ranger one. But I do like the Ranger one because it's quieter for my watercolor tutorials, so that's why I did that. So I'm just taking a black pen now and shadowing some of my letters so they stand out a little bit better. And then I used my white gel pen to complete the phrase, is it future or is it past? And I realize this is a card for a very small segment of the population. One of the coolest techniques when you use white embossing powder is coloring it with alcohol-based markers. So think about this. If you have a jar of white embossing powder and a set of alcohol pens, you can basically have any color embossing powder that you want that will be completely opaque. And I also like it that if I kind of change my mind, I can change the color. So that's what I'm doing here with this kind of golden yellow alcohol pen. And I used a purple and a brown one on the bottom. I think it looks really fun. I thought the card needed a little bit of extra something, so I went back in with my swirly stencil and some of this golden yellow ink and decided to do some stenciling to kind of get that swirl on the card. I also shifted the stencil up so I could make the swirl carry through the card, and I added some of that burgundy colored paint too, just so I could kind of fade it in and just give it a little bit of like the yellow swirls in front of him and the red swirls behind him, and I just thought that gave it a little bit more dimension. And then you can go over any of the gel pen again to make it brighter, and you can wipe off any paint that got on the embossed area. Just like we tinted our embossed area with Copic markers, or alcohol pens, I mean, you can also tint your gel pen white letters with colored gel pen if you want to. It's completely up to you. Just play with it and have fun. Don't be afraid to doodle with your gel pens, especially the white one. You can bring out little highlights to bring back that focal image again if you feel like it got kind of lost behind the stenciling and the other stamped images. You can also bring out your super darks using a black permanent marker, and I like to use my inexpensive Ohuhu markers for this because I don't have to worry about anything getting messed up on them too much because they were so inexpensive. I can just kind of play with them and have a good time. And now that you have your panels decorated, you can take a look at them, and we're going to do a simple process to turn them into a card. I thought because both of these cards are kind of film, TV show based, it would be cool to have kind of a movie film strip or a film type of mat, and that's what I'm doing here. So I cut a piece of black cardstock to 4 3/4 by 6 3/4 so it would mat perfectly on a 5 by 7 white card base. And my art is 4 1/2 by 6 because it was a 9 by 12 cut into quarters. Then I took a square punch and simply punched squares along 2 of the edges, and that gives us that cool film strip border. So all you have to do now is glue it down to the mat and then glue the mat to the card. Now, I will admit this card is a little bit labor intensive, but it was a lot of fun to make, and I honestly didn't know what I was going to do when I started off with these supplies and pigment powders and stencils, but I really am happy with the way it came out, and I had a lot of fun making these. I hope seeing the steps where I use the art media helps you look at your supplies with the new eyes and gives you some more ideas on how to use your markers, pigment powders, paints, embossing powders, whatever you happen to have. And if you want the exact supplies I used, I'll have a list in the video description, including links to our sponsor, topflightstamps.com, and a coupon code to help you save 10% on your order. And remember, they offer free shipping on orders over $50 in the United States. So check them out if you want to get these stamps, stencils, and pigment powders and paints. Thank you so much for watching. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. It really helps my channel out. And until next time, happy crafting.